Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. Welcome back. Today we're going to go over chapter 4, I believe. Let me just make sure. Yep, chapter 4. So this is module 5 because we're always kind of a week off, a week ahead. Everyone's doing great in the class so far. So let me go ahead and get started. Watch this lecture all the way through because I'm going to go through the quiz at the very end of it, and we'll talk about the questions and the answers on the quiz. The big takeaway in this chapter, chapter 4, is World War One, and World War One was primarily a European war, all right, primarily, and it's very interesting because I think what we're seeing in World War One is this beginning of industrial war and sort of industrial communications, and maybe, if you will, sort of the modern machines of war like the tank and the airplane was used for the first time in World War One. So for those of you who are trying to get your dates squared, right around 1900, so the 19 teens is World War One. World War II is going to be in the 1930s and 40s, coming up soon, but we're not there yet. And again, for those of you who are just kind of lost in where all these wars stack up in history, because I know a lot of people just don't know. The World War One is in the early 1900s. So that's around the time of probably your great grandparents. My grandparents were born or came over to this country early in the 1900s, and so that kind of gives you a time frame. And it's 50 years after, like, the American Civil War. So at this point, the U.S. is starting to build up as an industrial power, but it's really not interested in getting in the war at all. Very much isolationist at that time. The United States, we were isolationist in the sense that we wanted to remain isolated and really didn't want to get mired in world affairs. And the president was Woodrow Wilson, and he was more of an internationalist. And so there was a lot of tension between Wilson and people that didn't want the U.S. to get into the war. And we finally did, not in a huge way, but we did. Read about that, check it out. The World War One was awful. I mean, it was this trench warfare. A bunch of English and French guys died, I mean, quickly. This is one of those wars like the Civil War where, tens of thousands, literally, of men a day are getting mowed down in these fields. They get up and they get shot. So it was, sort of this old warfare tactics of getting up and charging with new weapons that would just mow people down. So it was pretty tragic. And there was really no single reason for the war other than nationalism. There's the shot, heard around the world, though, that started the war was the assassination of the Serbian prince. But really, other than that and other than nationalism, the reasons for the war are kind of hard to sort out, other than national pride. And what a devastating war for that reason. Introduces not only the industrial machines of war, as I mentioned before, but also like poison gas and all of that fun stuff. Not a great war. Wilson really afterwards wanted the U.S. to get into the League of Nations, and he was supporting something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which basically tried to outlaw war, which seems like a good idea. I know when I was younger and I first learned about it, I'm like, oh, outlawing war, this sounds great. But of course, that went nowhere. The League of Nations, the U.S. never joined. Congress never wanted to pass it. It was really the precursor to the UN in a sense. But we're kind of seeing right now the limits on the UN's power. So whatevs. But read about it. It's good to know about. And then as far as the other, I think the biggie is the Russian Revolution. So before 1917, Russia was a monarchy with a king and a queen and that sort of thing. And then in the 19 teens, so again, right around the time of World War One, the Russian Revolution occurred, and that's where Lenin and Trotsky and all of those guys kind of overrun the king eventually, King Nicholas, and take over. And it's really kind of where the Russian Socialist Democratic Party starts, where really communism sort of begins to be an institutionalized form of government in Russia at that time. So read about that. And the reason you want to read about that now, I know, like, why is this important? But Russia is still at it, trying to get back Ukraine, which was part of that territory back in the 19 teens. So it all kind of does tie into today's stories, if you will. So there's that. After World War One, the reparations or fines or punishment put on Germany were intense. So you'll read about reparations sends Germany into a depression, and Germany's not happy about that. And it really creates the atmosphere for the rise of World War II because Germany's in such bad shape with a depression. The citizenry is starving, inflation is out of control, and eventually Hitler rises up and says, hey, I can fix this. But that's another story for another time. But it's important to understand that after World War I, Germany is severely punished. I mean, they lost, and there's fines, and they have to pay all this money out, and they can't afford it. And that really kind of plants the seeds for the next thing that's going to happen. And then also really important is the Great Depression in the US. So the Roaring 20s give way to the depressing 30s here in the US. And there's the stock market crash, over exuberance of economic systems, if you will. And the Great Depression comes along. And back then there were no protection on bank accounts or unemployment or nothing like that. So the Great Depression happens at the tail end of this chapter, and part of what comes out of that is the New Deal, which we'll talk again about in another chapter. But the New Deal is kind of the first time that social safety nets are established, although they are by no means established equally in the US, but we'll talk about that later. So those are the important things in this chapter, chapter 4, so make sure you read through it. And now I will jump over to the quiz, and we can go through that real quick. So now this is good. So you may ask, Dr. Dan, why did the U.S. get into World War I? Well, there were a number of reasons, mainly to help out our allies. But one of the interesting things to read about is the Zimmerman telegram. And a lot of you probably didn't know about this. So the big technological thing of the day was the telegram, not the internet. Back at the beginning of World War I. And there was a telegram intercepted between Germany and Mexico. And basically Germany said, hey, Mexico, if you get on our side and attack the US, I mean, Mexico's in a great place to do that, then when we win the war, we're going to give you back the land that the US took from you, back in the 1840s and that sort of thing. So that's the Zimmerman telegram. Kind of cool, this electronic sort of the version of hacking from back then. So know that one of the reasons that the U.S. entered World War I was because of the Zimmerman telegram. Let's see, according to our book, the classic scenario for revolution, this is important, involves social discontent in the cities and in the country. When everyone is torqued off in a country, like when inflation is too high, there's gas lines, you're not getting your Medicare, you're not getting your Social Security checks, whatever. When the government really starts to fall apart, that's when social discontent rises. And when that happens, societies are primed for revolution. So like the Russian Revolution, and that's why we bring it up in this scenario. So that's a question on the quiz. Another question on the quiz is the two major factors that played a role in the Great Depression. There's a whole bunch of stuff that played a role in the Great Depression in the US, but the one you want to know about here is the effect of the downturn of European economies and the collapse of the US stock market around the same time. Those are the biggies. So you want to know those for the quiz. And then there's a question about mass culture. Another fascinating thing about the early 1900s, there was no mass culture beforehand, no like advertising, no national magazines, no McDonald's, no national chains, no nothing like that. And so mass culture really talks about, for the first time in the early 1900s, in this country and in Europe also, sort of the rise of feature films and books and radio and sports that were really national in nature, that sort of tied the country together as we're watching the same films and watching the same teams and reading the same books and eating the same food, watching the same advertising really brought us to this unique identity of being an American. And consumerism rises at this time. Fascinating time, I think. I know I'm probably not making it too exciting for you, but you just think about that. The rise of national brands, Campbell's Soup, Ivory Soap, all around this time. And it's this mass culture that brings Americans together because we're all doing the same stuff. So I think you can understand that. I think it's pretty cool. So anyway, there's that. And then the other thing is this early 1900s, sort of in response to World War I and response to the Gilded Age, where the rich guys controlled everything, sort of like today. The progressive era comes out of that in the US, and that's an era of reforms. Okay, so stuff that happens in progressivism, the biggie is that women get the right to vote in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. So you better know that one. You probably already do. But one of the questions in the quiz is about two examples of progressivism, and one of them is the passing of the 19th Amendment, and the other one is job opportunities for African Americans in the North and the Midwest. So we start to see more of this migration out of the South into the Midwest and up here to Toledo and up here to Detroit, where we start to see more example workforces forming because society changes during that time. And so these social reforms mean more opportunities for everybody. So that's a question on the quiz. That's all of them. It's the typical 5-question, 10 points a piece quiz, fairly straightforward. If you have any questions about any of this, let me know. And I hope you guys have a good day and stay safe. And that's it for now. Stay in touch. Bye-bye.